The first signs that something was wrong in Latoya's home did not arrive with the sudden force of a nightmare but crept in slowly, as if testing the edges of the family's sanity before revealing themselves fully. It began with her oldest son, a boy who had always been quiet but warm, whose laughter used to echo through the hallways in a way that made the little apartment feel alive. One morning, he woke with deep, purple bruises on his arms, finger-shaped bruises that looked as though someone had gripped him tightly in the night. Latoya questioned him gently, but he only frowned in confusion and said he didn't remember anything except a heavy feeling pressing down on him as he slept. She tried to dismiss it as restless dreaming, perhaps a fall from bed, but the pattern of the marks wouldn't let her. They looked too deliberate, too precise, and when she pressed her own fingers over them, they matched too perfectly. Within days, similar bruises appeared on her middle child, a sensitive boy who often clung to her when storms rolled in. His bruises formed thin lines across his ribs as if someone had dragged cold fingers from one side of his body to the other. When Latoya asked him about it, he only shook his head and said the house was talking again. She didn't understand at first and asked what he meant, but he grew quiet, staring over her shoulder toward the dark hallway, his expression distant and unsettled. Later, she would hear him whispering to himself at night, speaking in a hurried, trembled tone as though someone stood inches from his face, giving him instructions too faint for anyone else to hear. The youngest child changed next. A bright, energetic boy who once couldn't fall asleep without his favorite stuffed dog suddenly refused to enter his own bedroom. When Latoya tried to coax him inside, he clung to her, crying and insisting that something was standing in the corner. She checked the room each time, nothing but shadows and toys scattered across the floor, but the boy screamed whenever she reached for the light switch, as though darkness itself held a grudge against him. He began waking at exactly 3:07 a.m. every night, no matter what time he fell asleep. At first, Latoya thought it was coincidence, but the digital clock never lied, and neither did the terror on her son's face when he said someone had been sitting at the foot of his bed, humming softly. These moments unraveled the family's peace thread by thread, but the true disturbance came with the sounds. They began subtly, a faint tapping in the walls, the kind a mouse might make if it were lost behind the plaster. But the tapping grew louder night after night, occasionally shifting in pattern, like someone knocking from inside. When the children whispered that voices came from the vents, Latoya tried to comfort them, knowing fear tends to spread like wildfire in a home already tense. But then she started hearing the faintest murmur herself, low, breathy, as if someone spoke inches from her ear whenever she passed through the hallway after midnight. She told herself it was the old building settling, the metal contracting and expanding, the wind twisting through the ducts. She said it over and over in her mind, hoping repetition would carry truth behind it. Yet no building settling ever sounded like a voice calling her name. The behavior of the children escalated. Her oldest began waking in the middle of the night with his hands shaking uncontrollably. He would stand in the center of the living room, staring at the front door, insisting someone was waiting outside. Her middle child developed an aversion to mirrors, covering every reflective surface with towels and refusing to explain why. The youngest started speaking in a voice that did not sound like his own when he cried, lower, rougher, jagged at the edges like gravel dragged across metal. Latoya tried to chalk it up to sore throats, nightmares, childish imagination, but deep down she sensed that something unseen was weaving itself into their lives with patient, deliberate care. Then came the first event no one could deny. It happened late on a Thursday night when the air felt unnaturally still. The house was too quiet, as though the usual hum of electricity had been swallowed by something pressing in close. Latoya walked down the hall to check on the children and heard a soft, rhythmic thudding from behind the oldest boy's door. Worried he might be having another night terror, she opened the door slowly and froze. Her son was lying on his back in bed, fast asleep, but his body was rising several inches off the mattress, suspended in a slow, unnatural levitation. His arms hung loosely at his sides, but his face twisted in discomfort, eyes darting beneath his eyelids as though he were trapped in a dream he couldn't escape. Latoya rushed forward, grabbing his shoulders, pulling him toward the bed, but her hands met resistance, not from her son's weight, but from something unseen that seemed to hold him suspended. She pulled harder, desperate, whispering prayers she had not said in years, until the force suddenly released him and he fell onto the mattress with a sharp exhale. His eyes snapped open, but he didn't react to her presence. Instead, he turned his head toward the window and whispered a single phrase in a voice that did not belong to him, a voice that crackled with a coldness she had never heard before, a voice that made the shadows in the room seem to tighten around them, as though waiting for something more to come. When Latoya finally brought her children to the hospital, she hoped the sterile brightness of the building, the smell of disinfectant, and the steady rhythm of medical machinery would offer answers, or at least safety. But within minutes of their arrival, it became clear that whatever plagued her family had no intention of staying behind. The strangeness followed them into the emergency room like a shadow slipping beneath the automatic doors. At first, the doctors approached the situation with the calm professionalism expected of them, reassured by years of training that every symptom could be explained by biology, chemistry, or trauma. They asked questions about sleep patterns, diet, stress, potential injuries. They examined the children's bruises with clinical detachment, though some of the marks made them pause longer than expected. One nurse quietly pointed out the perfect symmetry of a set of bruises that looked disturbingly like fingerprints belonging to someone with an abnormally large hand. Another technician frowned at the way the youngest child's eyes didn't quite track movement the way a normal child's would. They lingered on empty corners more than they followed a person's face. Still, the staff pushed forward, trying to fit each oddity into a medical framework. That changed when the children were moved into a room for observation. Latoya sat anxiously by the youngest boy's bed while her two older sons waited in an adjoining area separated by a thin curtain. Nurses checked vital signs and made notes on their clipboards, though several of them kept glancing at the boys as if expecting something to happen. The air in the room felt heavier than it should, thick with a tension no one wanted to acknowledge. One of the nurses adjusted the monitor attached to the oldest boy and frowned at how the readings fluctuated without reason, spiking sharply whenever his gaze drifted to the corner of the room near the ceiling. She walked over to inspect the spot, shining her small penlight upward, but found nothing unusual, no insects, no loose wires, no visible cause for the boy's fixation. The turning point arrived without warning. A doctor knelt beside the middle child, trying to soothe him after he began trembling violently. He asked the boy to follow his finger with his eyes. The boy's stare shifted slowly, then abruptly veered to the side. His pupils contracted unnaturally, focusing on something over the doctor's shoulder. A chill ran through the air, sudden enough that the doctor himself shivered. Before he could turn around, the child's lips parted and his breath exhaled in a whisper too low to be deciphered. The doctor leaned closer, asking him to repeat it, thinking perhaps he was trying to say he felt sick or dizzy. Instead, the boy's mouth twisted into an expression that did not belong on a child's face. His voice rose to a pitch that made several staff members flinch, and the words he spoke did not resemble any language they recognized. It rattled out of him like the growl of an animal imitating speech. At that exact moment, the youngest child, who had been lying silently in his bed, suddenly sat up with unnatural rigidity. His small hands gripped the sides of the mattress, and his feet pressed against the surface as if bracing for impact. Without warning, his body began to slide backward, not toward the head of the bed but toward the wall behind it, as if something unseen were pulling him with deliberate force. A nurse gasped and tried to grab him, but her hand was knocked away by a sharp burst of cold air that seemed to emanate from the child himself. The lights flickered overhead, humming unnervingly as the bulbs dimmed and brightened with erratic pulses. The heart monitor beside the bed began beeping wildly, its screen flashing impossible numbers. One of the doctors, thinking the child was experiencing a severe neurological episode, shouted for assistance. But before anyone could respond, the older boy, who had until then been shaking quietly, rose from his chair and pressed his hands flat against the wall. His fingers curled downward, digging into the surface as if gripping invisible rungs. Then, before any of the staff could react, he began climbing. Not like a child using a ladder or furniture for support, but vertically, his feet dragging lightly against the wall while his body lifted upward in slow, jerking motions. A nurse screamed, stumbling backward and dropping her clipboard. The doctor nearest the door froze, his mouth half open, unable to process what he was seeing. The boy's head tilted unnaturally as he climbed, his eyes rolling upward until only the whites were visible. Latoya lunged toward her son, shouting his name, but the doctor held her back, his own hands trembling as he tried to maintain some semblance of control. He called for security, for anyone, his voice cracking as he did. Then, just as the boy reached the halfway point up the wall, every electronic device in the room abruptly shut off. The monitors went black. The overhead lights cut out. The room plunged into a cold, suffocating darkness illuminated only by the faint glow of the hallway beyond the door. In that moment of silence, something breathed. Not the children, not Latoya, not the staff, something deeper, heavier, closer to the floor than the ceiling, as if crouched among them. When the power returned seconds later, the boy dropped from the wall, landing on his hands and knees with a soft thud. He blinked up at the nurses with wide, confused eyes, as if waking from a long sleep. The youngest child fell back against his pillow, releasing a shuddering sigh. The middle child slumped sideways, suddenly exhausted. And the room, once filled with frantic movement, settled into an eerie stillness. The doctors looked at one another, unable to speak. They knew what they had witnessed, but their training had not prepared them for anything like this. Some backed away slowly, their faces pale, their minds scrambling for rational explanations. Others stared at the children with a mixture of fear and pity. In the days that followed, several would request transfers, others would quietly adjust their schedules to avoid the case, and one would simply never return to the hospital at all. The social worker assigned to Latoya's family was not inexperienced. She had handled cases involving neglect, domestic conflict, severe trauma, and situations that would keep most people awake at night. She considered herself grounded, rational, and skilled at separating fact from fear. When she was first briefed on Latoya's case, children with unexplained injuries, claims of paranormal disturbances, and medical staff shaken by what they had witnessed, she assumed the family was under extreme psychological stress. Trauma could make people see patterns where none existed. Grief could twist shadows into shapes that felt threatening. Her job, she told herself, was to offer support, not fall into the hysteria she believed others had succumbed to. But her confidence began to crack the moment she stepped out of her car and approached Latoya's house. The air around the property felt unnervingly still, like everything within a few feet had fallen under some invisible pressure. Even the trees seemed frozen, no rustling leaves, no movement in the branches, no breeze brushing along her skin. It was a silence too deliberate to be natural. As she walked up the creaking porch steps, she felt the wooden boards vibrate faintly beneath her feet, not from her weight, but as if something inside the house responded to her presence. She shook off the sensation and knocked on the door. Latoya answered quickly, relief on her face as though she had been waiting for someone to help her carry an unbearable burden. But her eyes darted nervously over her shoulder, scanning the dim hallway behind her instead of focusing on the visitor. It was a subtle detail, but it lodged itself in the social worker's mind immediately. The children greeted her quietly, each with a guarded expression that didn't match their age. The oldest kept wringing his hands. The middle child hovered behind Latoya, peeking out at her with wide, anxious eyes. The youngest clutched a worn blanket, his gaze fixed on the floor. She introduced herself gently, trying to ease them into conversation, but they responded with short, clipped answers. Their behavior might have been attributed to fear or shyness, but the way they continually glanced toward the hallway, the living room, and especially the basement door hinted at something more. Latoya began explaining the strange events, the bruises, the voices, the sleepless nights, the levitation she had witnessed, but the social worker listened with a clinical distance, maintaining a sympathetic yet skeptical expression. She took notes, asked questions, and observed the children for signs of emotional distress or environmental triggers. It was when she requested to inspect the home that the atmosphere shifted in a way she could not ignore. The moment she stepped into the living room, a wave of cold air washed over her, sharp enough to make her gasp. The temperature dropped so suddenly that her breath became visible. She checked the windows, they were closed. She checked the vents, they were silent. Before she could comment, the middle child whispered nervously that it always gets cold when it watches. The social worker glanced toward the hallway, but saw nothing except the shadowy outline of the basement door slightly ajar. A faint, rhythmic tapping drifted up from below. Something about the pattern made her skin tighten. It was too even, too purposeful, like knuckles against wood. Determined to remain composed, She approached the basement door, intending to examine it. The tapping stopped the moment she touched the knob. The house fell into a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. She opened the door slowly. The stairwell below was enveloped in darkness, dense and absolute. It felt like a void rather than a room. She flicked the light switch. Nothing happened. She clicked it again. Still nothing. Latoya stepped behind her, explaining that the basement light had burned out days ago and they hadn't replaced it because no one wanted to go down there. The social worker aimed her phone's flashlight downward, revealing only the first few steps, dusty wood, and a crude dirt floor at the bottom. She could have sworn she saw movement in the edge of the beam, but when she focused the light there, the space remained empty. As she turned away from the basement, she caught the briefest glimpse of something from the corner of her eye, an outline in the dark, hunched and almost human-shaped. She whipped her light back around, but the shape was gone. Her chest tightened. For the first time in her career, she couldn't label what she felt as fear rooted in logic. It was something older, instinctive, primal. She tried to regain control by focusing on the children's rooms next. When she entered the youngest boy's room, she noticed deep scratches on the wall near the window frame. They were too high for a child to reach and too irregular to be made by any household object. As she leaned in to examine them, a soft whisper drifted through the room, so faint she thought it might have been her imagination. Except the youngest boy heard it too. He covered his ears and cried out, begging it to stop. Her composure broke when she felt a sudden pressure against her back, as though someone had shoved her forward. She stumbled, catching herself against the wall. The children weren't near her. Latoya was several feet away, frozen in terror. The social worker turned sharply, expecting to see someone behind her, but the space was empty. Her throat tightened as she realized the shove had come from nowhere. Overwhelmed by fear that she could no longer rationalize, she ended the visit abruptly, claiming she had gathered enough information for the day. But as she stepped outside, a sensation crawled over her skin, a heavy, lingering presence that felt as though something unseen had followed her onto the porch. She walked quickly to her car, resisting the urge to look over her shoulder. That night, long after she returned home, she awoke to the sound of footsteps in her hallway. Slow, dragging steps. When she called out, no one answered. But she sensed it. Whatever haunted Latoya's family had found its way into her home, and from that moment on, she refused to go back to the house or speak of what she had experienced. The police officers who arrived at Latoya's home were not easily rattled. They had handled violent confrontations, drug houses, break-ins, and situations far more dangerous than anything a distressed family could describe. When the case was first brought to their attention, most of them assumed it was another incident involving psychological stress or a domestic situation spiraling out of control. But after receiving the hospital's report, one that conspicuously avoided details yet included words like unexplainable, unprecedented, and staff traumatized, they decided a welfare check was necessary. They drove to the house expecting to calm a frightened family and clear up exaggerated claims. Instead, before the end of the night, several of them would swear never to return to that address again. The air outside the home felt unnervingly still, much like the social worker had experienced days earlier. The yard was silent, not a single insect humming, not a single leaf twitching in the wind. One of the officers commented that the place felt wrong, earning a few chuckles from the others, but even they spoke in lowered voices as they approached the porch. Latoya met them at the door, pale and trembling, insisting she had heard something moving in the basement again. Her children huddled behind her, silent and frightened, and the officers exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't behavior they could dismiss as simple panic. There was something deeply unsettled in the children's eyes. When they stepped inside, the temperature dropped in a way no thermostat could account for. One officer rubbed his arms, muttering that it felt like stepping into a freezer. Another scanned the ceiling, looking for vents blowing cold air, but saw none. The dim lighting in the home flickered intermittently, making the living room shadows pulse and ripple along the walls. The officers began their inspection, checking each room methodically. They examined the children's reported bruises, the scratches scarring the bedroom walls, and the deep grooves in the hallway floorboards that looked like something had been dragged with significant force. Despite their initial skepticism, their expressions began to shift from professional neutrality to wary discomfort. The real turning point came when they approached the basement door. Latoya stood several feet away, her hands clasped tightly as she begged them not to go down. But protocol required them to inspect every part of the home, especially since some of the disturbing events seemed to originate below the floor. One officer placed his hand on the doorknob, then paused. The metal felt icy to the touch, far colder than it should have. Another officer shined his flashlight at the door, noticing faint smudges along the bottom, small, dust-covered footprints that resembled those of a child. But the footprints did not lead down the stairs, they led upward from the basement. The officer swallowed hard, trying to rationalize the sight as residue kicked up from storage items or dirty shoes, but the prints were too small and too defined to dismiss. When they opened the door, a rush of cold air swept up the staircase, powerful enough to flutter their uniforms. The darkness below seemed heavier than normal, swallowing the beam of their flashlights almost immediately. The first officer stepped onto the top stair, the wood creaking under his weight. He descended slowly, every step echoing unnaturally loud in the cramped space. The others followed, forming a tight line as they made their way downward. The basement smelled of damp earth and something else, something sour, metallic, and faintly burnt. When they reached the bottom, their lights finally illuminated the dirt floor, the cracked foundation walls, and the scattered debris that looked as though it had been disturbed recently despite Latoya's claim that no one had entered for weeks. One officer directed his flashlight across the floor and froze. In the far corner stood a small wooden box, covered in dust yet showing signs of recent movement. A faint scratching sound came from within it, steady and rhythmic, as though something inside was clawing to get out. Another officer whispered that it might be an animal, but the scratching was too controlled, too deliberate. They approached slowly, nerves taut, until the box rattled violently, sliding an inch across the floor without anyone touching it. All of them stumbled back, weapons drawn, their breaths held in terrified silence. The air thickened around them, pressing against their chests with an invisible weight. Before they could decide whether to open the box or flee the basement, one officer pointed his flashlight toward the far wall. Embedded in the dirt were symbols, crudely drawn, as though carved by fingers rather than tools. The shapes were unfamiliar, angular, chaotic, twisting into patterns that made their stomachs churn as if they were looking at something not meant to be seen by human eyes. Beside the symbols lay a small pile of objects, pieces of cloth, broken toys, a shoe that looked far too tiny to belong to any of Latoya's children. The officers exchanged alarmed glances, their skepticism collapsing under the weight of the scene before them. Just as they backed away from the wall, something shifted in the shadows. A scraping noise echoed through the basement, soft at first, then growing louder as if something large dragged its limbs across the dirt. The officers turned their flashlights toward the sound, but the beams flickered violently, threatening to go out. A shadow, massive, shapeless, and impossibly dense, moved along the far corner, absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. One of the officers shouted, and the group bolted up the stairs, stumbling over each other in their urgency. As they reached the top, the basement door slammed shut behind them with a force none of them applied. They erupted into the living room breathless and shaken, their composure shattered. None of them wanted to discuss what they had seen, but the fear on their faces spoke louder than words. Before leaving, one officer told Latoya to stay elsewhere for the night, though he could not provide a logical reason. Another quietly wrote in his report that he refused to re-enter the home under any circumstances. By morning, 3 of the officers had filed transfer requests, and one would later admit, in a moment of vulnerability, that he still heard scratching behind his bedroom walls long after the incident. The priest who eventually agreed to visit Latoya's home did so reluctantly, not out of disbelief but because he had encountered enough unusual cases to know that stepping into situations like this often meant stepping into something he could not fully control. He had heard the accounts, the hospital staff shaken, the children exhibiting impossible behavior, the social worker refusing to return, and the officers who fled the basement with fear etched into their faces. Yet for all the terror surrounding the house, there was also a thread of duty pulling him forward. The family was desperate, and the parish had grown concerned enough to escalate the request. So he arrived quietly one late afternoon, armed with nothing more than a worn Bible, a small flask of holy water, and a resolve tempered by years of spiritual responsibility. From the moment he entered the home, He sensed a heaviness that made the air feel thick, as though something unseen pressed down on the house and everyone inside it. Even before speaking to the children, he felt watched. Not merely observed, but studied, as if whatever lingered here was trying to determine whether he posed a threat. Latoya explained the most recent incidents, the sounds in the basement, the sudden coldness, the increasingly disturbing behavior from her children. As she spoke, the priest noticed how her voice trembled, not with fear alone, but exhaustion. Whatever they were facing had worn her down to the edges of herself. He began by observing the children individually. The oldest boy avoided eye contact, his gaze constantly drifting toward the corners of the room where the shadows seemed to thicken unnaturally. The middle child wouldn't speak at all, he only trembled when the priest approached, as if sensing something approaching with him. The youngest's behavior was the most concerning. His expression was blank, detached from his surroundings, yet his small fingers tapped a steady rhythm against the arm of the couch, tap, 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 as though communicating in a pattern known only to him and something else. The priest asked permission to pray with them, and Latoya agreed instantly. As he began reading aloud from scripture, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that his breath became visible. The children reacted immediately. The middle child clamped his hands over his ears and whimpered, shaking his head violently. The oldest curled into himself, breathing hard, muttering words under his breath that made no sense. The youngest simply stared at the priest with eyes that no longer looked like a child's, the tapping of his fingers slowing and deepening, the rhythm becoming something deliberate and mocking. As the prayer intensified, so did the disturbances. The lights flickered overhead in an erratic, almost frantic pattern. A low hum began vibrating through the walls, not mechanical, not electrical, alive. The priest remained steady, determined to maintain control of the situation, but even he felt the oppressive force growing, coiling around the room like a tightening rope. When he sprinkled holy water toward the children, the oldest boy recoiled violently, screaming in a voice layered with a depth that did not belong to him. The middle child collapsed onto the floor, shaking as though he were being pulled from inside. The youngest let out a sound that resembled laughter, but it was broken, jagged, echoing in a way that made every adult in the room freeze. The priest paused, trying to regain composure. He moved closer to the youngest child, who watched him with unwavering stillness. As he leaned forward to touch the boy's forehead, the child's hand shot out and gripped his wrist with a strength far beyond his size. The priest gasped, not because of the physical pressure, but because the boy leaned in, so close that his breath brushed the priest's cheek, and whispered something in a language the priest had never heard. The words were guttural and cold, and though their meaning was unclear, the intent behind them was unmistakable. It was a warning. Before he could react, a violent force rippled through the room. The furniture shook. A picture frame fell from the wall and shattered. One of the lamps exploded, sending shards of glass across the floor. Latoya screamed for her children, but they appeared unreachable, trapped somewhere between fear and possession. The priest knew then that this was no ordinary haunting. Whatever was in this house was not merely tormenting the family, it was claiming them. Determined to break the moment, he raised his voice and continued praying with a force he hadn't summoned in years. His voice echoed strangely, bouncing back at him from the walls as if something repeated the words in a warped mimicry. For several agonizing seconds, the air seemed to vibrate with an unseen struggle. Then, just as suddenly as the chaos had begun, it ceased. The room fell silent. The lights steadied. The children collapsed into an exhausted, trembling heap on the floor. The priest lowered his Bible slowly, unsure whether he had succeeded in pushing something back or merely angered it. He advised Latoya to leave the house immediately, not as a suggestion but as a warning born from experience. He told her the place needed a full investigation, possibly a formal exorcism, but he would need approval from higher authorities given the severity. When he stepped outside, the air felt oddly lighter, but not enough to lift the dread coiled in his stomach. As he walked toward his car, he felt a coldness behind him, not a breeze, not a shift in temperature, but a presence. He did not turn around. That night, he reviewed his notes with trembling hands. Though he had faced darkness before, this case felt different, deeper, older. The next morning, when he attempted to contact the diocese to escalate the situation, His phone malfunctioned repeatedly. Calls dropped. Lines went dead. Documents he tried to prepare vanished from his computer. And each time he closed his eyes, he saw the youngest child's face as it had changed, subtly but undeniably staring at him with a knowing expression, as though the entity he had encountered now recognized him, and recognition meant he was no longer outside its reach. By the end of the week, the priest made a difficult decision. He would proceed with an official intervention, regardless of the risks. But deep down, beneath his practiced resolve, he understood something chilling. The presence in Latoya's house was not simply waiting for them to return. It was preparing.